Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for taking part of this wonderful event. And special thanks to the organizers for doing all this work to make this possible. So my two general goals in this paper are first, to question the explanatory role of implicit bias in approaches to social injustice, and second, a defense of a structural explanation of one particular type of injustice, what I call speech injustice. So speech injustice happens when speakers' social position distorts the performative force of their speech acts. In this way, they are prevented from doing with their words what they intended to. Usually this distortion enhances an existing disadvantage. This is a breed of what Miranda Fricker classified as testimonial injustice and Rebecca Kukla recently identified as discursive injustice. Two examples of this is when imagine a woman trying to assert something, but the audience takes this assertion as an expression of emotions, or a woman trying to give a command, but the audience takes it as a request instead. So individualistic explanations of this kind of injustice would say that this occurs because hearers have implicit or explicit negative attitudes against the speaker's perceived social identity. This kind of explanation we find it in Rebecca Kukla's when she comments or discusses discursive injustice, and Miranda Fricker's when she discusses epistemic injustice. But this explanation does not situate individuals in their social reality. When we think about conversations, we see that they happen within social structure. I take Saray Haslanger's definition of social structure as a network of social relations, themselves constituted by practices. These practices locate us in different positions in the structure, what she calls nodes. So within a social structure, we find different positions or nodes, and from each node there is a limited range of possible things you can do or possible outcomes. Haslanger discusses the example of a mother, spouse in a heterosexual relationship, in a community with no affordable childcare, and with a male spouse that, given the gender wage gap, is earning a significantly higher salary. So when a child arrives, there are not many options for this person occupying this node. And when she decides to quit her job, an explanation of why she did so needs to account for this, or needs to appeal to these other factors other than her own preferences. So this, or the possibilities from each node, are governed by, now speaking in particular of the case of conversations, what you can do from each node once you are taking part of a conversation is governed by discursive norms that operate upon intersecting social categories. Compare, for example, what a homeless person can do with their words in a particular conversation to what a middle-class person can do. Or compare, for example, an immigrant when entering a country or applying for a visa compared to what a border officer or the visa officer can do with their words. So depending on the social categories you embody and the different dimensions of social identity, there are going to be different norms operating, limiting or enhancing the things that you can do with your words. So my hypothesis is that in many contexts, speech injustice is not the result of unskilled listeners who, due to implicit or explicit biases against the speaker's identity, do not appropriately apply the relevant discursive conventions to that speaker's intervention. It is rather the unfortunate result of perfectly skilled listeners who are appropriately applying unjust conventions that are operative in their communities. When I say unjust conventions, I mean conventions that systematically distort the speech capacities of people perceived as occupying certain social positions. So my proposal is that in those contexts in which discursive interactions are governed by unjust conventions, the best explanation of speech injustice is going to be structural explanation. But we can say, wait, how does the existence of these unjust conventions help make the case for structural explanation? Because we can always say that these conventions work through the minds of individuals. So the explanation is going to be still in terms of people mental state. So it's going to be, at the end of the day, an individualistic explanation. But in response to this, we can say that when we have a norm that prescribes a particular behavior in a given context, this norm can be seen as enough of a reason to exhibit that behavior in that context. Therefore, in order to explain that behavior, we don't need to appeal to particular mental states, but rather to the existence of that norm. Taking an example from Utich and Lombroso, if we try to explain why this person is wearing a graduation gown in a graduation ceremony, we don't need to posit any special mental state in her mind other than she's conforming to the norm in that context. But if this person is wearing the graduation gown on the beach, in order to explain that behavior, probably we will need to posit to assume some particular mental states about that. So to conclude, when we see, so what is a better explanation of speech injustice, an individualistic or structural explanation? Well, my 2 points are that we don't need to appeal to implicit bias in order to explain speech injustice. So an explanation of a norm-conforming behavior does not have to invoke any mental state about the content of the norm, other than a general disposition to conform to it. So applying this to speech injustice, we don't need to postulate implicit bias in hearers' minds in order to explain speech injustice. The existence of operative social norm governing speech interactions is enough to explain this phenomenon, even if we don't have those norms explicitly articulated but merely practice them. And the second point is that we do need to appeal to structural constraints if we want to explain speech injustice. So explanations invoking implicit biases could account for the phenomenon only, for speech injustice, only in a society where interactions among individuals are not governed by unjust norms. But if behavior is governed by norms that are sufficient to produce unjust treatment regardless of idiosyncrasies of individual attitudes, then individualistic explanations alone can't adequately account for the contrast between just and unjust societies. And that's it. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will welcome any comments and any suggestions and any complaints about this. Thank you very much.